So that's the About Me section out of the way. Let's move on to Doctor Who and my opinions on it. So I've got a big stack of questions here, all very, very similar, and I kind of expected this. Topping it off is Darth Who, 1939, and they ask, who is your favourite Doctor? Benjamin James Barker, he says, my man, I'm wondering which Doctor is your favourite. Personally, mine is Tom Baker, the 4th Doctor, and he's followed pretty closely by the 12th Doctor, Peter Capaldi. Jude Monge, you have stated in the past that you love all of Doctor Who, but do you have a personal favourite Doctor, least favourite Doctor, favourite season, and least favourite season? D. Kent Flyer asks, when did you first start watching Doctor Who, and do you have a favourite story? Mr. Azmat Mahmood asks, favourite classic and modern Doctor Who story? JP1377 says, what are your favourite new stories and classic Who stories? And James Marshall says, what is your favourite classic and modern era episodes? So a lot of similar questions there, and I'm going to disappoint you a little bit because I don't really have a favourite Doctor. The Doctor who I grew up with, so to speak, was a little bit of Sylvester McCoy. He was the current Doctor, although he wasn't on television when I was first into Doctor Who, and then Paul McGann became the 8th Doctor midway through my sort of childhood, really. And although he wasn't on television, I did used to read, as I'll get to, the 8th Doctor books, and so he was sort of my Doctor in a way. So I do have a great fond spot for those two incarnations. I think I would say I prefer more a type of Doctor than a specific Doctor as such, because as was pointed out by Jude, I do love all of Doctor Who, and I love all the Doctors. But there are ones that I prefer, should I say, and it tends to be the more alien, more eccentric, maybe slightly more silly incarnations. But I like them when they have that sort of underlying steel. So Patrick Troughton is a perfect example of that, the 2nd Doctor. Tom Baker is the epitome, really, of the eccentric Doctor. Also Sylvester McCoy. And Matt Smith, I would say, of the modern era. Those are the sort of Doctors I tend to gravitate towards more and sort of relate to a little bit more. The more perhaps socially awkward Doctors, but at the same time have a real strength and a kind of a flip-flop between silliness and seriousness. I think it with those incarnations, the idea of the Doctor sort of putting on a facade, covering up who he is really, this ancient being, this wise creature, is a little bit more apparent, and perhaps that's why I enjoy them a bit more. When it comes to favourite story, I do have a favourite Doctor Who story, but I'm not going to tell you what it is because we haven't covered it yet, but it's coming up. See if you can guess which one it might be. I don't really like to label things, say least, I don't like this is rubbish, because I think there's a lot of things on YouTube especially, and social media generally, which kind of it sets out almost to attract views by being overly critical of things. When you see videos that say, did it suck, and all that kind of thing, I mean, the video itself might well be different, but that immediate thumbnail kind of sets out almost a tone and a statement of intent that I don't really subscribe to. I don't really like that notion of, evaluating from the bottom up. As a teacher, we're always taught, believe it or not, to when we mark, to celebrate the positives, to look for the good things, and not be blind to the shortcomings of work, but to find, how many marks has this student gained rather than how many has this student lost. And that's a philosophy or an approach that I try and carry over into my general life. There's plenty of stories that I did not have time to cover in my prior videos. I either had little clips from them or I couldn't mention them at all. And some I really had to struggle over, do I talk about this one or do I talk about that one? Obviously I had to settle on one, didn't have time for the other. So going forward from the 1st Doctor to the 6th Doctor, which is where I got up to at the moment, other stories, if you're interested, you don't know them, you might want to check them out. There's the Aztecs, the Time Meddler, the Crusade, the Power of the Daleks. The Faceless Ones, a lot of people don't like that one, find it a bit boring, a bit pedestrian, but I don't know, I just really like it. I love the fact that like part of it was shot at Heathrow, in an actual, or was it Gatwick? I might be getting mixed up, but it was certainly a real airport. Evil of the Daleks is a fantastic one. The Mind Robber, that was a real story. I really was tempted to put that one in on my Patrick Troughton episode. Third Doctor, the Silurians, or Doctor Who and the Silurians, as is his actual title. The Demons is a real classic Doctor Who story and a real fantastic example of the Third Doctor's era. Planet of the Daleks is one of those cookie cutter Terry Nation Dalek scripts that I mentioned in my Fourth Doctor episode, but nevertheless it was one of those ones that was repeated back in 1993 when I first really started watching Doctor Who, and so whenever I watch it I have this sort of nostalgic feeling. I really enjoy it. Terror of the Zygons, Brain of Morbius, Seeds of Doom, Horror of Fang Rock is a brilliant Terrence Dicks story. State of Decay from season 18. It's quite unusual in season 18. That was the last season that Tom Baker was in, then when John Nathan Turner took over, because it has that sort of gothic tone of the Philip Hinchcliffe era. Probably because it was written long before and wasn't made due to a conflict with an adaptation of Dracula that the BBC were making, so it was pushed back, eventually commissioned in his final season. But I really enjoy that one. I like the ideas in it. And Fifth Doctor Enlightenment is another one that I really wish I'd been able to talk about. And Mind Warp of the Sixth Doctor's Trial of a Time Lord season, another one that if I'd had a bit more time, I would have put into the Sixth Doctor video. It's a bizarre one, it's unusual because obviously, like all of Trial of Time Lord, you're watching, like the Time Lords are, like the Doctor is, the evidence on a screen, and in that one it's quite clear, or it becomes clear, that the Valeyard has manipulated what we're seeing. So it's you're unsure about what is real and what's not, but it's an interesting little story. A bit of a whistle-stop tour there through my opinions, but I am conscious that I don't want to make this video, days long. Next up, we've got a question from Matt of Matt's Movie Reviews. If you haven't checked out his channel, you really should. He's an up-and-coming channel, and his approach towards the criticism of films that he's looking at is similar to my own, and a little bit more positive. Let's fight against some of that negativity, that cynicism that we encounter on a daily basis in multiple forms of media. He does some fantastic retrospectives of classic films, and he's got one upcoming for one of my favourite films of all time, Jaws, so I'm really looking forward to that. So check him out if you haven't already. I'll put a link in the description. Matt's Movie Reviews asks, nice lighting setup, sir. Thank you very much. It's quite a funky. I didn't do this for this. This is just for my own personal benefit. I want some neon. Congratulations on your continued subscriber growth, more than deserved. Thank you very much, Matt. Where do you see the channel going after you complete the Doctor's incarnations? I think I'll come back to that question a little later because it keys in with some more questions we've got. And do you have a favourite TARDIS interior? Well, if we're going to really get our geek on, I would say I was thinking about doing a video at some point about the TARDIS, and I might cover some of what I'm going to touch upon here and that. But I think that you can't really beat that initial Barbara walking through the doors in An Unearthly Child and seeing that vast space. It gradually got smaller over subsequent stories and seasons, but that initial shot of the TARDIS with the computer banks, the fault locator, the hexagonal lighting above the console, it's a great shot and a great design. I also really like the sort of 80s console room post Five Doctors, the redesign of the console. I was very geeky when I saw that in the Doctor Who experience in the flesh, so to speak. I would say, though, actually, probably my favourite would be the Peter Capaldi interior. I know that it came in with Matt Smith in his sort of latter half season, but I think it came into its own. It's a fantastic design. I love the fact that it manages to mix the kind of eccentricity or the sort of bookishness or scholarliness of the Doctor with the kind of technological sleekness And I think other console rooms have either been a little bit more slapdash, a little bit thrown together, or they've been a little bit too clinical. And I thought that balanced really well, because when Capaldi came in, you'll notice he got the blackboards, he got the books stacked up on the steps. It really feels like a lived-in space, and that's one of the issues that I have a little bit with the Eccleston Tennant TARDIS, is that it's just barren. You know, sometimes there's a coat thrown over one of the coral supports, but generally it doesn't really feel like a lived-in space. I'm sure there's good reasons for that, but it's something that I enjoyed. And also take that moment really to acknowledge Michael Pickwoad, who unfortunately passed away very, very recently, the production designer who designed that TARDIS. He was a fantastic set designer, and I think that the whole production was elevated by his input. So rest in peace, Mr. Pickwoad. Next question by a man called Richard. Hello, you got a fantastic name. He says, I'm curious if you think an actual Doctor Who movie would be a good idea or a bad one. The idea has been floated a few times. What circumstances would be needed to make a 55-year-old TV show make that transition? And if you didn't think it would be a complete mistake, which I'm by no means ruling out, what themes or canon would you personally like to see it tackle? Brilliant question. Whenever a TV show does well, there's always talk about, well, let's make a film, as if the television show isn't legitimate enough as a piece of media. I think in the modern era, with the rise of sort of long-form television, things like Game of Thrones, House of Cards, these more expensive, lavish productions that have storylines that run over subsequent episodes with enormous budgets. In some cases, certainly in Game of Thrones' case, the budget far outweighs the vast majority of films we see in the cinema. I don't think there's necessarily that same drive as there once was. I wouldn't say that a Doctor Who movie wouldn't work at all, but I think it would have a challenge, because I think you would have to do a film which could stand in its own right. I think the studio would demand that, really, to get the largest number of bums on seats across territories. You know, this wouldn't be a film that would only be seen by British audiences, or if it was, it certainly wouldn't be given an enormous budget to justify doing it as a theatrical production. You can't expect, I think, a movie audience to come to the cinema knowing the backstory, knowing the characters, unless it's a sort of an event like the Day of the Doctor shown in cinemas simultaneously with the television programme. But, you know, that wasn't shown in cinemas in order with the expectation of making the millions and millions of pounds that it would need to, had it been purely funded on that basis. So I think if you were to do a Doctor Who movie, you'd have to do either a complete reboot, which I think the vast majority of people, me included, would not like, or you would have to do something that would be standalone, almost like a soft reboot. So, you know, you could do like the first episode of A New Era as a film, but do you really need to? I don't think there's necessarily that need. I mean, Doctor Who, you know, benefits from a larger budget these days. It benefits from, you know, a greater sophistication of its visuals, but it's never really been about that. And I think that's something that makes the show enduring, besides the, you know, devices of the Doctor's regeneration and all that. I think its existence for so long as being a show that was done on a relatively small budget meant that the kind of the foundations, the skeleton of what Doctor Who is founded on something that is not about the visuals. It's not about the spectacular special effects. It's about the imagination. It's about the ideas. It's about the themes. And so, you know, a film version could only really bring a slightly more spectacular visual side. And I don't think that that's necessarily needed for Doctor Who. So going on from that, we've got High Voltage, who asks, do you think the Seventh Doctor's era is underrated? Because he's my favourite Doctor, and in my opinion, his last two seasons are great. Well, I absolutely agree with you, High Voltage. I do think he's underrated, massively. And I'll explore this a little bit in my Seventh Doctor episode of my series that I'm working on at the minute. But I really like Sylvester McCoy as a person and as the Doctor. I've met him a couple of times. I've been very lucky to do so, and he's a lovely man. And he has had a real commitment to a show and to keeping the show the different projects that have kept it alive until the reboot, if you want to call it that, the return of it in 2005. That he's really been unfairly treated by a lot of the general press. He and Colin Baker. You're absolutely right. Those last 2 seasons are great. They've got some really, really good stories, and I'm going to explore that a little bit in my next episode. We have The McCrimmon. Is it Jamie? Don't know. Love your series. By far the best standard and quality of content of this nature I've ever seen. I'm always massively flattered by such superlative comments. Thank you very much. It's also really interesting to know that bit more about the deeper inner workings. Thank you. You're welcome. What do you think could or should have been done to save Doctor Who and continue it into the 90s? Interesting. To save Doctor Who. Well, I'm going to explore this a little bit, as I say, in my next part about how Doctor Who ended up being cancelled in the late 80s. The thing is, as I sort of alluded to slightly with High Voltage's question there, the last 2 seasons of Sylvester McCoy's era were a hell of a lot better than what had gone before. But unfortunately, by that point, there weren't as many people watching. So it was a little bit like too little, too late. I don't think... I'm not one for regret. I'm not one for going back and changing things. But, you know, really, if we had wanted Doctor Who to continue into the 90s, I think it would have taken, first of all, the people who were higher up at the BBC actually giving a damn about it, because Michael Grade and Jonathan Powell really didn't. And that wasn't just down to John Nathan Turner's interpretation of the show. I think that just gave them the ammunition that they needed, because certainly Michael Grade had a real negative antipathy towards anything like Doctor Who. So it had needed that. It had needed the support that it now enjoys, or at least has done since the show returned. But it would have probably needed a refresh earlier on. John Nathan Turner was producer for a very long time, and a lot of people might see that as him sort of hanging on and controlling it. Hopefully in my next episode I'm going to put forward a few arguments that might counter those points a little bit. He wanted to leave far sooner than he did, but the simple fact is there was no one who wanted to take it on. So, you know, but if there had been someone, if there'd been someone who was willing to take it on, to take up the reins, to take it in a new direction, to refresh it a little bit, someone who perhaps understood what was needed for the show to regain some of that integrity that perhaps it had had in the 70s. So that's what I'd say. An earlier refresh. Ready Productions asks, what classic Who monsters and villains do you want to see return? That's a really good question. I think in the last few years we've had a little bit of fan service when it comes to returning villains, and not that I'm complaining. I mean, seeing the Mondasian Cybermen in Capaldi's finale was not just a present to him, but to us fans as well. I think the ones that I would choose would be the ones that I think would add something a little bit different to the show. In the modern era, something they haven't really covered. So I'd like to perhaps see a little bit of an exploration. It doesn't have to be a straight sequel as such, but I'd like to see a little bit of an exploration perhaps of the Sirens from Pyramids of Mars, maybe bringing them in. They were mentioned loads in sort of continuity referencing novels in the 90s, but I think that you could do a story there, and the vast majority of people watching wouldn't need to know that, you know, Sutekh was an Osiren and this is a sequel to an earlier story. A little bit like the Macra in Gridlock. You don't need to have seen or heard the Macra Terror to know to get it. I mean, they're almost like a cameo really in that. But I'd like to explore, you know, that idea of Egyptian history. I mean, Egyptology's only really been done that one time in Doctor Who, and I think it's a it's a fascinating little epoch historical thing to explore. The Autons, I mean, Russell T Davies had them in Rose, very much as a kind of a side story almost to the story of the Doctor and of Rose, and reintroducing the show. Obviously, he cribbed their most famous thing, smashing through the glass windows, and you actually saw the windows smash, so he sort of ticked that little box. But I think, and also, they had a sort of reappearance in the Pandorica Opens as part of the general thing. But I think the Autons returning would be an interesting little story in some fashion. One that a lot of people have talked about for a while coming back is the Rani, the sort of female time lady who is a renegade, a little bit like the Master. The reason why I say the Rani would be interesting to come back is because I think she's a great character, but on television at least, in her 2 stories in the 80s, I don't think she was really used to her full potential. This is a character, she's not just a female Master, because you'd say, well, the female incarnation of the Master would fit that bill. She's someone who is not evil as such, but someone who is amoral. She sort of typifies the scientific indifference, the pursuit of knowledge, the ends justifies the mean kind of person. Certainly in her first story, at least. And I think that would be something that would be interesting to bring back and explore, that you could have the Doctor, who is this scientific, rational character, but someone who's grounded in a moral and ethical standard, against the alternative, someone who's purely scientific, almost robot-like in a way that doesn't see the emotional need of, if one person is sacrificed for the need of more, then what's the problem? I think that would just be interesting to explore those moral, ethical questions. So that's who I'd like to see show up again. Tiny Plays asks, do you think Paul McGann is a brilliant Doctor? That's a very interesting question. Because, if we're talking about Paul McGann and we're talking about the 8th Doctor, we've got a lot of different versions of that character. If we're talking about Paul McGann in the TV movie, I think he's the best thing in it, as I'll explore when I get to that. I think he was a fantastic choice of Doctor. I think he really encapsulates in his performance an interesting incarnation, but is still true to who we know and love as the Doctor. The audio version of him is similarly brilliant, but it's a slightly different portrayal. It's perhaps slightly less manic, slightly more confident. And then, of course, you've got the books and the comic version of the 8th Doctor. But to cut a long story short, yes, I do. I think he's a brilliant Doctor. Because I do think all of them are brilliant Doctors. And I'm just saying that. I don't think they've put a foot wrong. I really do enjoy the 8th Doctor, and he's the version of the Doctor who I've encountered the most in different forms of media. The irony being he was only in that one film and then in the Night of the Doctor short, but he actually, I believe, holds the record for the most number of stories containing that an incarnation of the Doctor, which is probably followed shortly behind by the 7th Doctor. Just because of the long stretches of time where the BBC wasn't making the programme, and so the current Doctor was sort of in limbo. But I'll explore a little bit more about Paul McGann when we get to his episode. Following from that, Alexander McCrae asks, if the Doctor Who TV movie had been successful, do you think the Doctors after McGann would have been the ones we know today or not? Plus, do you think it still would have lasted until now? I don't think... I think it's obvious that would they have cast the Doctors that we know in modern Who had the show continued and got to that point? I don't know. Probably it's unlikely, only because the show, the different incarnations that were filled in those wilderness years would have set a tone, a style. And obviously when you have a new Doctor, when you cast a new Doctor, they tend to cast someone who's quite different from the previous incarnation. So, would we have ended up with the same permutations? And and would the same showrunners have ended up working on the show? If it had been successful, I think that we would have a very different form of Doctor Who. It would have evolved out of that. And I'll explore this a little bit more in my Paul McGann video. But those of you that don't really like the TV movie with Paul McGann, when I show you, if you're not aware of some of the other possible versions of the Doctor Who TV movie we could have got, I think you'll probably think yourself lucky that we got what we did. It's not a brilliant version of Doctor Who, and it has a lot of missteps in it. If it had been taken up, I think some of those pressures from the American studios and the need at the end of the day to satisfy an audience who perhaps were less familiar with it, the competition that was on television at the time, things like the X-Files, would have pushed the show in a different direction stylistically to what we're familiar with. It would have been formed more by American television and the needs of that audience. Because after all, the TV movie, when we're talking about ratings, was a success in this country. It had, I believe, over 9 million viewers on its transmission, but it was the American audience that was the real clincher, really, for the studio. So when it comes to, would we have had the Doctors that we've got, I think Capaldi would probably have ended up being the Doctor at some point, perhaps. I mean, he's someone who's got quite a good profile across the Atlantic, and also he was actually considered. Did he audition? I think he may have auditioned even. I need to do my research again, but I think he may have auditioned for the Paul McGann, what became the Paul McGann TV movie. But he felt he was too young at the time. Perhaps later he'd have changed his mind. So he was definitely on the radar. Maybe Christopher Eccleston may have shown up at some point. I could see him having the similar desires that he had. I mean, he partly decided to be the Ninth Doctor because he wanted to do something a bit different and show people that he could do, a nice character rather than the kind of crazy people that he tends to be cast as, and have something I believe that his children could watch and enjoy. So, and again, he's someone who has a bit of an international profile. So those two actors might have shown up at some point. Would it have still lasted until now? I don't think I can really answer that. I think that Doctor Who, as an idea, as a mythos, if you like, is something that's enduring. But that doesn't necessarily mean it would endure in one particular medium forever. I think Doctor Who would still be around, there'd still be a fandom, there'd still be a Doctor Who magazine, there'd probably be books, there'd probably still be the same kinds of media we had in the Wilderness years. I don't know if the programme would have lasted because it's been so long now since then, 22 years since the TV movie. That's a hell of a long time for a television show to keep going, especially if it's being made primarily by a network in America that is all about the ratings. Kraken Geek Productions asks, what would you do for your own series of Doctor Who? And goes on to ask, have you any plans about Big Finish? Do you like goats? And thoughts on Series 11? I do like goats. They're okay. I was a vegetarian for a very long time, so I've got a bit of an affinity for animals. I do intend to look at Big Finish, and I'll come back to that in a later question, along with my thoughts on the upcoming Series 11. So I'll go back to your first question there. What would I do for my own series of Doctor Who? Well, I don't think that I'm anywhere near talented or creative enough to imagine myself as showrunner of Doctor Who. So I'd think about, what do I enjoy? What aspects of Doctor Who are particularly my favourite? And I would say I really enjoy the Hinchcliffe Gothic spooky era. So I think that if I was to make Doctor Who, I'd probably have more of a Gothic spooky tone. I'd make it perhaps a bit scarier. I might have slightly a slower pace. I'm not sure if that would kill the show off, if people would still watch it, but I feel sometimes the modern era, the pace is a little bit too quickly, or at least towards the end, where things get wrapped up a little bit too quickly. Sometimes that's satisfactory for me, and they tend to become a little bit repetitive in the way that these stories are concluded. So I might slow the pace down a little bit, perhaps do 2-3 parters, but I'm sure that would be an absolutely insane decision, and I would be the last showrunner of Doctor Who if that happened. Any Old Biscuit asks, what did you think of Dalek War, which include Frontier and Space, Planet of the Daleks, the E-Space trilogy, the Black Guardian trilogy, the Ashildr stories, and the Monk trilogy as arcs, and should there be more of these style of mini-series within a series in the future? Well, I think when it comes to Frontier and Space and Planet of the Daleks, I think there's less of an arc really, because the sort of Planet of the Daleks doesn't really refer much back to Frontier and Space. In fact, the whole issue of the sort of galactic problem and the conflicts between the Draconian and the humans is not quite resolved by the end of that, and then it's not really referred back to. It kind of almost is reminiscent really of the early years of First Doctor, where the end of a story would be the cliffhanger that led into the next story. We compartmentalize, we take stories, we say here's the 7 parts of the Daleks, but the viewers that watched it originally from week to week had a different title for each episode. It wasn't episode 1 of 4 or something, and so it felt like this ongoing thing. And I think Frontier in Space and Planet of the Daleks is sort of in that tradition. I would say probably the Key to Time arc was probably the first really contrived story arc in a time way before people were doing that kind of thing, and I think it's rather mixed. The E-Space trilogy with Tom Baker is interesting. It doesn't always live up to its full potential. The Black Guardian trilogy is something that I enjoy. I really, really like Enlightenment, as I mentioned earlier. The Ashildr stories and that season as a whole really were an experiment really in having sort of 2-parters which were not quite 2-parters, almost like 2 linked stories, and I thought that was an interesting experiment. I did enjoy the explorations of different things through those 2 stories. And the Monk trilogy was. I felt the ending was a little bit unsatisfactory, but I enjoyed the setting up of it and the kind of different. It's different from a 2 or 3 or 4-part story because you've got 2 or 3 separate tones, separate ideas, usually a different writer as well. I kind of thought that was interesting and maybe worth exploring in the future. But I think when one of the joys of Doctor Who is having that next week will be somewhere completely different. There'll be something different. It'll be history, or it'll be future, or it'll be a parallel dimension, or it will be a fictional world like the Mind Robber, and that original that freshness as the stories go on is something that I love about Doctor Who, and is why I don't really ever get tired of it. I read Doctor Who books continuously, and all through the year. I read a lot of other books as well, but over half, pretty much, of the books I read per year are Doctor Who stories. And I listen to Big Finish pretty much every night when I go to bed. And I just love the fact that, you've got the familiar characters or character types, but you're in a completely different setting, a different world, different time, different tone. And that's something that I think if you do too many story arcs or do too many season-long linked ideas, you kind of lose some of that. You can't, I love the idea of picking a story off the shelf and watching it on its own one night, and sometimes I feel if I pick up one of those I've got to watch the whole lot, so that's something. It's interesting. I'm not sure if it's the way forward. Guy Grissar, sorry it's a bit late, don't worry, it's certainly not. But my question just struck me. What medium do you think Doctor Who works best in? Is it better working with a strict budget limitation, or when the writer's imagination is unfettered by one? That's a fantastic question, because as I've said, I've enjoyed Doctor Who and still do across lots of different mediums. What do I think it works best in? I think it works best in television, to be honest. That's how it began. It has literary allusions, it has inspiration from literary heritage, but at the end of the day, that's its home. It's not a permanent home. It's something that can come and go and has done. but I think that's where it works best. The nature, though, of how that medium is then used to do it can change, and I think there's different ways of doing it. Like I said, the shorter, fast-paced episodes that we have in modern Who, sometimes I don't think do justice to some of the ideas, some of the creative ideas that are going into it. And I think it could slow down a little bit more, perhaps have a longer season, but at the end of the day, there's not the budget for that, I'm sure, and they've just made it 10 episodes rather than 13, albeit, as far as I understand, they're going to be slightly longer episodes, so we'll see how that turns out. There's always a budget, there's always a limitation to what can be achieved, and that's true of modern Doctor Who just as much as it was true of classic. But as I've said before, not only for classic Doctor Who from a different era, from a different expectation of television production, but I think also in the modern era, we don't have to see the Time War, or we can see glimpses of it without having to realise the whole thing for it to work well as a narrative device. I think that a budget limitation can sometimes bring out some fantastic ideas and some fantastic stories. Case in point, the Mind Robber, the first episode of the Mind Robber, really came about because there was no money to do it as a 4-parter, as it is in the next 3 parts, and it led to some really clever ideas. The 2-parter, sort of inside the spaceship, the third Doctor Who story, is a really interesting little 2-parter that explores the characters and sort of arrives at some closure of the conflict and the tension between the Doctor, Susan, and these unwilling companions, Barbara and Ian. And that came about because there wasn't any money left for the first block of stories that they were doing. So budget limitations can actually lead to genius. I think when you've got everything you can do, it's tempting to just focus on things that are very superficial, and not having that option forces you to really focus on something that's perhaps a little bit more wholesome and a little bit more enduring. Badre Bali asks, what would you say is your favourite non-TV Doctor Who story? I've enjoyed so many, actually more non-TV Doctor Who stories than are actually in existence of TV stories, so again, very, very hard for me to pick from. If I was thinking of novels, I really enjoyed Alien Bodies. That was one of the first ones that I read, an 8th Doctor novel early on in the 8th Doctor run, the BBC novels by Lawrence Miles, and it kind of set up a big story arc that was running through the rest of the novels. A later one from the 8th Doctor run, Camera Obscura, I thought was fantastic. It really captured some of that tone, some of that mood, the sort of gothic Victorian spookiness that I really enjoy in my fiction. The Witch Hunters is a brilliant novel. I think they reprinted that a few years ago when they did a run in the 50th anniversary, but if you haven't read it, you should check it out. It's a historical novel with the First Doctor and his first TARDIS crew mixed up in the Salem witch trials. Matrix, of course, which is what I'm still adapting as an audiobook, is another formative and important book in my Doctor Who library. 7th Doctor. Alongside that, in the New Adventures, the Virgin books, I think Human Nature, which was eventually adapted by the author into the 2-part David Tennant story with Martha, that's a real standout star of the range. And another one which I only read quite recently, and I wasn't expecting much. It was Russell T Davies's first and only novel in the Doctor Who range until he adapted recently some of his stories from Modern Who, and it's called Human Nature. Big Finish adapted it, I believe, into an audio, which I haven't heard yet. I'm not quite sure how they did that. It's the epitome of Virgin New Adventures Doctor Who. Violence, sex, drugs. And I didn't think I would like it, because that's not normally how I like my Doctor Who. But I just found it fantastic, compelling, and interesting little twists and turns, and really original and really clever and creative. It's kind of like if you took Russell T Davies's whole era and squashed it into one, in the sense of, you know, he had some good ideas, but I felt that, you know, he kind of almost rationed them out. This is clearly, you know, someone who's really wanted to write for Doctor Who for a long time, and he's cramming it all in, and he makes it work really, really well. So that's another fantastic piece of non-TV Doctor Who. When it comes to the audios, there's two in particular that I always go back to and listen to, and I don't think these will come any surprise to people who are fans of Big Finish, but Spare Parts with the Fifth Doctor, which is about the Cybermen, sort of genesis of the Cybermen. It's sort of name-checked in the two-parter with David Tennant that reintroduces Cybermen, but that story really has nothing in common with Spare Parts. It's a brilliant story, and it fits in with the existent canon. Another brilliant one is The Chimes of Midnight with Paul McGann's Doctor and Charlie. It fits into a slightly longer story arc about Charlie, his companion, who he saved from a certain death, and that causes disruptions in the timeline and in creation. But it's a really, really interesting, it's clever, it's funny, it has a really dark sense of humour that Robert Sherman did so well in his audios. And it's quite moving as well, and it works brilliantly on audio. It's not a story that you could do in television Doctor Who, for example. For one thing, it would have a lot cut out of it towards the end because it gets quite dark. Comic books. I've enjoyed Doctor Who comics for years in Doctor Who magazine every month. In fact, the magazine was kind of based around that originally, so they maintain that long tradition. One particular story, which was probably the first arc that I read, was, I believe, called Wormwood, which was actually the finale of an ongoing story arc. And currently, the Doctor Who magazine has what I believe will be the final Capaldi strip, and that has got some references back to it. So if you've been reading that and you're interested in Fade and Shade, that is a really seminal story for that. And also it was really, really clever. It was very controversial at the time, and I might mention this in one of my videos, because they apparently killed the Doctor and regenerated him into Nick Briggs. And there were so many complaint letters coming, how dare you do this, you know, you just killed Doctor Who. But it was a very clever little device. And another one would be The Flood, which was sort of the last Paul McGann 8th Doctor comic leading into when the new series started, and has a sort of future version of the Cybermen. That's a great one to check out as well. So, you know, there's a whole list of things. I'm sorry, I can't always pin it down to just one, but, you know, amongst the hundreds of books and audios and comics that I've read, they would sort of be my select few. Jordan Afield asks, do you feel the position of showrunner on Doctor Who is a poisoned chalice? That's a great question. I think short answer would be yes, I think it is. Especially in the modern day. Especially with, I think that the position of showrunner on any beloved programme, franchise, or one that becomes beloved and then continues with a established fan base, becomes a poison chalice to pass on and to inherit, because just people are so critical of everything. And yeah, it shows that they care. It shows that it means a lot to them. But you know, I don't have to go through in detail and explain how vociferous I think a lot of people's criticism have become recently of relatively trivial things. Films, actors, performers on social media being harassed, being criticised, being made to feel awful. Their families are affected by it, and I think that's a real dark and uncomfortable aspect of modern society, and it's something that it angers me, not only because of the just completely unfair bullying and treatment and outright discrimination sometimes that happens there, but also because there's so much more going on in the world that's so much more important to really get that passionate about, to want to change. Doctor Who, I don't own Doctor Who. Okay, as an audience member, I enjoy it. I feel like I have ownership over it because I have all this trivia in my head. But at the end of the day, it's not my program. It's for everyone. It's made for everyone. It is there to be enjoyed by current and future generations. And there will be aspects that don't appeal to me. There will be parts that I don't agree with. There'll be decisions made that I don't always approve of. But if it stays true to what I enjoy about Doctor Who, then I will continue to enjoy it. If Series 11 comes along and it's not very good and it's not for me, I won't watch it. Simple as that. And that's not something small for me to say. This is a show that I've enjoyed for 25 plus years, and I have a love for it. But I'm not going to start messaging Chris Chibnall and saying, you've ruined everything, because I will appreciate that he is coming from a place of caring for it, and he has a vision for it, and he wants to set it out. And if there's an audience for that and it's successful, and I'm not part of that audience, then fair enough. That's just the way it is. So yeah, I do think it's a poison chalice because of the way that nowadays people have far more opportunities to communicate their approval or disapproval, and they do that in a very passionate and very polarized and binary fashion. I'm more of a centrist generally in politics and in the sort of debates that go on. I don't think you either have to love or hate it, Captain Tyrrell asks, does the Peter Cushing Doctor count in the great scheme of things? Yeah, he counts, but it depends what you mean by count. If you don't know, Peter Cushing, the famous, legendary, veteran British screen actor, portrayed a character called Doctor Who in two movies in the 1960s, which were adaptations of the first two Dalek stories. He's establishing that as a human, as an inventor of TARDIS, not the TARDIS, a time and space vessel, which on the inside doesn't look anything like the TARDIS console rooms that we know. And yeah, I mean, they're fun, and I might well look at those at some point. I think they're an interesting little addendum to the Doctor Who thing. When it comes to canon, he's not the Doctor. Even those efforts, I think Stephen Moffat put a little reference into his recent novelisation about how they were films made in the Doctor Who world portraying him, or something like that. It's an interesting little way of solving the problem. And you can accept it or you can't accept it. It doesn't matter. Whatever you want it to be. I mean, if you want to imagine that the Peter Cushing Doctor is an incarnation of the Doctor who's been, in the future, who has been changed with a chameleon arch or whatever. I mean, that's the great thing about the show. We can come up with ways of explaining and fitting them in. If we don't like them, we don't like them. We don't have to be that specific about it. For me personally, Peter Cushing is not an incarnation of the Doctor that we have seen so far. But they're enjoyable. They're worth watching. They're more about the Daleks than about the Doctor. Shyman asks, do you think an Eccleston return for a multi-Doctor story is realistic now that he's embraced the fandom by doing his first convention, and the fact that nearly everyone he might have had a problem with is gone? I'm going to explore a little bit more about Eccleston and his choice to leave the programme and his choice not to return in subsequent at invitation of Stephen Moffat for the Day of the Doctor. But I think, you can never rule anything out, really. I mean, he's an actor who enjoys taking on new roles and moving on. He's a chameleonic actor. He doesn't necessarily want to be associated with one particular act. Having said that, I mean, Patrick Troughton was the same. He was someone with a morbid fear of typecasting, and he came back several times. 3 times. I must correct my Colin Baker video where I said it was his second appearance when he showed up in the Two Doctors. He came back 3 times. And I knew that. So, you can never really rule it out. He might feel a nostalgia and a pang for it. I don't think it's something that's going to happen anytime soon. I think that a little bit like when we launched into the Matt Smith era with Stephen Moffat coming in, this new series that's coming up will be a statement of intent. It will be a conscious decision to veer away from the style of the previous few years, and those previous few years were certainly exemplified in the latter few years of a lot of what people call fan service, continuity referencing, things like that. And I think that they will want to make this a statement of it's still the same show, but it's a fresh start. Martin James asks, thank you for your fabulous in-depth work on the series so far. I was born in the 1980s, so technically my Doctor would be Sylvester McCoy. So I'm very much looking forward to the next part of your series. My questions are, number one, out of all the books you've read during the Wilderness years, the end of the TV show, the movie, and until the RTD era, which do you think would make a good TV episode and could have saved the show? That's an interesting two-pronged first question there. What would make a good TV episode? And that's an interesting point to make. They won't necessarily be the ones that I've mentioned already, because something like Damaged Goods, for example, I just don't, it'd have to be R-rated for one thing. I don't think it would be carried off that well visually in a Doctor Who story. There's some very strange conceptual stuff that happens towards the end that I don't think you could really do effectively. Plus, Russell T Davies kind of recycled a few of those ideas, and that's another thing to mention really with that, is that a lot of the modern era does draw on aspects, not just where they've adapted ones like Human Nature, for example, but there are aspects that the N form at the end of Damaged Goods, with its amalgamation of the woman, I've forgotten her name now, but that's very, very similar to the Cyber King in the next Doctor. So there's elements that are fed into the new series. What do I think would make a great TV story? I think, if we were to say, what would have saved the show, we need to think of stories containing that sort of TARDIS crew. I think Illegal Alien, which was my very first Doctor Who novel that I read, beyond some of the Target novelizations when I was very little, which was actually submitted by Mike Tucker, I believe, to the production office in the sort of last year of Doctor Who before it was cancelled. Cybermen during the Blitz. That would make an interesting story. I think that would have done well. Again, I don't think any of them necessarily would have saved the show. I don't think there would have been one story. It's not quite as simple as that, I don't think. And it certainly wasn't one story that killed the show. So, I don't think would have saved the show had it come out. I don't think everyone would have gone, oh, well, it's completely reinvented now. There would have to have been an earlier and more consistent shift across a season and further stories, further years for it to be saved. His second question is, do you think ending Doctor Who the way they did, with Ace and Seven walking into the sunset, as it was then an odd sci-fi relic of the 1960s, was the right thing to do, discounting its now multi-million pound juggernaut? I don't think they had much of a choice, to be honest. They didn't necessarily expect the show to be cancelled, and that was something that was done very much at the last minute. I think Andrew Cartmel wrote their leaving speech, and it was recorded. Ironically, I believe Sylvester McCoy recorded his voiceover on the 23rd of November, 1989. So it was actually the anniversary of Doctor Who. Weird timey-wimey. I've always enjoyed that. I think that the choice to end it that way meant that it could continue on. They were off for further adventures. And I think that that was a nice way to end it, really. It didn't have to be some massive sacrifice of the Doctor. It didn't have to be a regeneration. It didn't have to be a big cliffhanger. I just liked the idea of them walking off for further adventures like it was any other story. Third question, could you ever see it ending if it did in the same way, just pulling the plug and walking away? I think if it was to end, which it will do, the television show will in one way or another come to an end. I don't think Doctor Who as a story, as a mythos, as I've said already, will come to an end necessarily, as long as there's those of us who enjoy it and want to contribute to creating it. But the television series will end its current form at some point, and yeah, I think that would be the best way to end it, because Doctor Who has become something now, and I don't think it's hyperbole to put it in the same status of things like the Robin Hood myth, so to speak, and the legend of King Arthur, all these kinds of things. This is part of our folk story, our folk history in a way, and it's something that can be handed on. Just because it's a 20th century product, a visual audio medium, doesn't make it any less worthy of living in the imagination of future generations. So I don't think the story will ever end, and it shouldn't. So if they were to finish one form of it by them walking off into the sunset, so to speak, and off on new adventures, I think that would be a perfect way. There shouldn't necessarily be a conclusion. A couple of questions, very similar here. We have Just Tired, says, thanks for the retrospective. I've watched them a countless amount of times whenever I'm bored. You must be seriously bored of my voice by now. And I'm wondering, what's your position on modern Doctor Who in terms of continuing the legacy? Good or bad? Missing something or added something? And Phil W asks, what are your thoughts on the rebooted Doctor Who overall? Do they feel like an extension of the classic era, or a thing in its own right that can't be compared? I enjoy modern Doctor Who. There are some people I know who reject modern Who and see it as an abomination, but then I have known of people that reject everything that happened after William Hartnell as an abomination, or anything that happens after Tom Baker as an abomination. So you're going to get people that reject aspects. I enjoy modern Doctor Who. I think it's a great continuation now. There was a bit of a misstep perhaps with the Paul McGann TV movie. Visually, superficially, there are elements there that link it to the classic era, the rest of the classic era. But I think the modern show, it's made by showrunners and writers who understand and appreciate and respect its history and its core themes and ideals, and so I think it is a worthy extension of the era. If you were to hold me down and say which would I rather watch, the classic or the modern, I'd probably go for classic, but that might just be nostalgia. It has its shortcomings, but then so did the classic era. If you're going to consider, one of the things I'm doing with this video series is trying to consider Doctor Who as a continuing, ongoing show that was developed and influenced by cultural and social developments and changes, and it's easy to cherry pick the fantastic, the best, the brilliant examples, but most people would say, if you were held down and said, would you rather watch Blink or Time Flight, they'd probably go for Blink. I'm sure I'll get lots of comments now who say, no, Time Flight is amazing and it's brilliant. Hude MX or Hudemx asks, great video series, keep up the great work. I shall do. Really enjoying your videos. Who was your first Doctor, or what was the first episode serial you ever saw of the show? Have you ever watched a dubbed episode of Doctor Who in German, French, Spanish, and what are your thoughts on the classic series Blu-ray release? Now, you're cheating there. That's 3 questions you slotted in there. As I said before, you want to know about how I came to Doctor Who, you're probably best watching part 1 of my series again. I don't really remember what was the first one I watched. As I said, I have this memory of a Dalek next to a brick wall, which could be Remembrance of the Daleks. I think it would be brilliant if it was, but I don't know if that's real. I don't know if that's a constructed memory that I've sort of thought up later on. It's too early. I mean, I was I would have been, 4 years old when that was on, and I don't think it would probably have been... I don't think I would have remembered it that clearly. So I don't really remember. I mean, the earlier stories I watched was the ones I remember actually watching were on UK Gold on their 30th anniversary weekend, the celebration of Doctor Who. They randomly showed, single episodes, I think. So it was episode 4 of Logopolis, which I had no idea what was going on. There was, I think, episode 2 or one of the episodes of Warrior's Gate, and then there were the repeats on television of the Demons. There were Planet of the Daleks, Genesis of the Daleks, I think, was on at some point. So they was probably my first episodes to watch. But I always felt, the current Doctor, my Doctor, was Sylvester McCoy until 1996, where my Doctor became Paul McGann. So that's probably all I can say really about that. I've never watched an episode of Doctor Who dubbed into another language. I think it would be interesting. I do know that I can't remember what country it was now, but there was the same voiceover artist was used for several Doctors, so it must have been quite confusing when Sylvester McCoy's Doctor was having the same voice as Tom Baker for some of the audience. But I don't know, maybe it helped sell the idea this was the same character. The only dubbed Doctor Who I've ever seen was a little snippet of Inside the Spaceship, where the first Doctor makes a speech about the birth of a solar system, and it was dubbed into Arabic, I believe. So that's the only thing I've really seen of that. Interesting question though. What are my thoughts on the classic series Blu-ray releases? I was intrigued by them. Someone else said to me, you must be disappointed now. You've got the whole collection now to come out on Blu-ray. Not really. I read the article about them in Doctor Who magazine. That tempted me a little bit. I don't think I'm going to invest in them, and I don't really necessarily think that the amount of effort it takes in to restore things and upscale them and all this, I don't think is going to be enough interest for the entire run. I think that they're just going to do sort of seminal eras as such, because they need to make the money back for their investment. For me, at the end of the day, Doctor Who wasn't shot in high definition. It was shot on videotape, and the very early years, very low scale definition compared to what we're used to, as I explained in my William Hartnell video. So the notion of taking these old videotape masters and upscaling them, it doesn't really appeal to me. I don't really see the point. The only real story you can do that with is Spearhead from Space, which has already been done on Blu-ray, and I own that, and that is brilliant because that was shot on film. That looks amazing. But then saying that, I think it was shot on 16mm. I might be wrong, but still, it wasn't the kind of film stock you'd expect from a big theatrical release. So it's still not perfect. So it doesn't really appeal to me that much. Some of the new documentaries they've put on there, some of the new special effects they've apparently put on there, I'll kind of be interested in it. But I'm happy with my collection, and I also like those stories as separate DVDs. I've got Genesis of the Daleks, I've got the Sontaran Experiment. I've got those as separate little stories that I can pick off the shelf. Now I've got a whole set of questions on a very similar subject. So we've got T. Gushinair. Love your video series. I appreciate and enjoy all the hard work and effort you put into it. Thank you very much. A truly professional job, more than worthy to be on a DVD series in any Doctor Who collection. Well, I'm not sure about that. My questions are: who's the first Doctor you ever watched? Who's your favourite or favourites? What's your opinion of Jodie Whittaker so far from trailers we've seen? Thanks for all that you do. Jacobs also asks, are you looking forward to the new season of Doctor? They keep reading comments where they see that there's some people excited, there's some people who are not so excited. I, for one, don't mind change as long as it's well written, has a reason for changing. Rory Connolly asks, what are your expectations for the upcoming series of Doctor Who? Anything you're looking forward to or worrying about? And also Kevin Collins says, how do you feel about the new direction Doctor Who is going? Okay, so this is a bit of a hot potato. This is a bit of a big topic at the moment amongst, at least online, amongst people commenting. I like to reserve my judgment at the end of the day until I see it. I don't like to prejudge these things. I am excited about the new series. I'm always excited about a new series of Doctor Who. I like seeing the different iterations. I like having a bit of fresh blood in the writing team. I know that a lot of people, there's a bit of a reaction at the minute towards, in general media, towards what's perceived as a bit of a social justice agenda. I take on board the comments that people are making of that, but I don't entirely agree. I think it's important that a television programme that is publicly funded, like Doctor Who, by the public, has a duty to represent that public. And the simple fact is that Doctor Who, whilst always being a progressive show with some missteps, has for a while now been dominated, like most television, not only in front of the camera by, middle-aged white men, but also behind the camera in the writing team. And I think it's important that people who are not like me, white, male, straight, have people that they can relate to and be represented by. As someone who works with young people on a daily basis, I do understand it's very, very important for young people that don't conform to these sort of traditional ideas of sexuality or gender identity or whatever, to have people that they can explore those ideas with in a very safe way. I mean, that's what literature, that's what films do. I don't think that agenda, if you want to call it that, makes the programme less valuable and less legitimate at exploring these things. It doesn't have to be, and I'm sure it will not be, a really obvious, in-your-face, politically driven idea. It's just about having a little bit more representation. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I will explore that a little bit further. I will take this opportunity, I've mentioned it a few times in responses to comments. In my first video, which was made long before Jodie Whittaker was cast as the Doctor, I presented my viewpoint, which was that I felt that the Doctor's gender as a male was important, and I'd like to sort of clarify that, because I kind of regret a little bit not being clear. I think some people have misunderstood from their responses. It's obvious they've misunderstood somewhat what I was getting at there. What I really meant there was that first of all, there is an alternative argument to he's a bloke, which is generally what people fall back on. There is a sensible and I think logical and rational argument to say that the Doctor represents a male role model who doesn't conform to the usual stereotype. But I think what I missed there, and something that I've realised since, is that when I was growing up, a male identity figure was someone that perhaps I, at that age, could only identify with. I didn't necessarily feel that if the Doctor had been a woman, I would have been inspired and been able to relate to that character in the same way. And that's a real shame. And I think that's a reflection of the more binary, polar opposite sort of time in which I grew up. What I realise now is that, I really do hope that young boys will see the Doctor, the 13th Doctor, as much a role model as they would a male character. You don't necessarily need to have someone. That's the point that I think a lot of people are missing. They'll say, well, girls need someone they can identify with, someone who is the lead rather than the companion. And I think that's true, but I don't think that's the point. I think a better point is that it shouldn't matter whether it's a man or a woman for young people of both genders or indeterminate genders to be able to identify with that character. So that's how I feel. I am looking forward to it, but I do understand, I do sympathise with some people's views. I just wish that people wouldn't write it off so instantly without really giving it a chance and seeing, and then if it isn't what you like, it's not the end of the world. You're still there. There's still white men represented, plenty of them in mass media. I think I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to the series. I've got no idea what we're going to see. I avoid spoilers, so the only information I've really got is what's in Doctor Who magazine, a couple of clips. I must admit, I did see the leaked clip, which was going around of Jodie Whittaker as the 13th Doctor, and that more than the trailer, I think, got a clear idea of the kind of Doctor she's going to be. I enjoyed what I saw, and I must admit, when Capaldi regenerated it into her and she had that kind of shocked face and that smile and then said brilliant in that brilliant Yorkshire accent, I really, really smiled. Whereas most of the time when the Doctor regenerates, I'm sort of like, not sure. I was when Matt Smith first appeared. I was kind of like, I don't know this guy, I'm not sure about this guy. But with Jodie Whittaker, a big smile on my face. So I am looking forward to it. I must admit, though, just as an extra thing, my only thing that makes me a little bit cautious is I'm not entirely convinced, and maybe I'm doing him a disservice, I'm not entirely convinced if Chris Chibnall will deliver the kind of Doctor Who that I enjoy. I've enjoyed his prior contributions to Doctor Who, his different stories, but none of them have been particularly groundbreaking. So I'm not sure. We'll see. I'm cautiously optimistic. Juan Jose asks, with the debut of Jodie Whittaker on the horizon, I'm curious to know which actor or actress you would like to see entering the TARDIS, either as a Doctor or as a companion. That's a brilliant question. I think when it comes to male actors, I'm not sure, really, to be honest. I'm not that great. I would be rubbish at casting the Doctor, to be honest. I'm going to sort of take your question slightly and skew it a little bit. It's like, who else who is a woman, who is a female actor, would be good, in my opinion, in the role of the Doctor? Who could be successors to Jodie Whittaker, perhaps? I think two people that I think would be really interesting and take the role in really interesting directions. Whether they'd be interested in it, I have no idea. But Emma Thompson, I think, would make a really, really good Doctor. I watched a brief interview with her on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert the other day, and I just thought, and that she just had she has that eccentricity, she has that Britishness that I think it really exemplifies as really suitable for the Doctor. And Julie Walters, who's a brilliant, long-standing veteran actress, I think she'd be great as the Doctor as well. So sorry if I didn't quite answer your question, Juan, but it was quite a broad one. Philip needs to write, apparently, and he asks, is there any missing episode in particular you'd like to be recovered? So going back to Classic Who now, missing episode in particular that I'd like to be recovered. Obviously Marco Polo, and I've talked about that at length and why I enjoy it so much. I'd love to see that. Maybe it would be disappointing now, it's sort of in my imagination, but I've seen enough set photos, I think, to get a realistic sense of how it actually looked, and I think it would have looked brilliant. Also, Evil of the Daleks, something that I didn't mention in my Patrick Troughton episode, because I talked about the Daleks at length in the first Doctor story, so I focused more on the Cybermen, but both the Dalek stories of Troughton's time are particular favourites of mine. I'd really like to see Evil of the Daleks, particularly the latter episodes on Skaro with the Emperor. I think that would be great. Crystal Blue Mage asks, do you think it would be a good idea to remake just one of the Lost Classics with lookalike skilled actors? The unused clips from Twice Upon a Time look promising in that regard. To see if that is a thing at all, or would there be an uproar? Would there be an uproar? I think there's always going to be an uproar from someone. I think, it's worth a shot. I think I would be able to differentiate the classic, the original, from the remake. It doesn't replace it for me. It's a little bit like sequels, and people go on about, you know, the director comes back, you know, like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Indiana Jones 4, oh, you raped my childhood, I can't watch these now. I don't have the same feeling about that. I still can enjoy the original without, you know, there being a sour taste left on my mouth because of an unsatisfactory sequel. So, you know, I think it'd be worth a shot. Why not? I think it would be a good idea. Yeah, how would you sell it to an audience? How would you secure the funding for it? That's a larger question. Magellan the Cat asks, given that Big Finish Productions has put out more Doctor Who in the last 18 years and consistently better than the BBC has put out in 50, do you think they should be considered or evaluated as a superior resource for introducing people to the show? That's a great question. A superior resource. I think the thing about Big Finish, they're brilliant. There's some fantastic stories that you can share with people, you know, that have probably never even seen Doctor Who. But, you know, a lot of their stories rely on some connection, some understanding of not just the wider story, the wider foundation of Doctor Who, but also some of the visuals, to be honest. You know, what is the TARDIS? What is a police box? A lot of people don't know that these days. I mean, if they've seen Doctor Who, they know what it is, but, you know, what does a Dalek look like? You know, these things are fitted into our kind of general zeitgeist, but I think you've got to have had some understanding, some knowledge of the visual side of it in order for the imagination to help. Maybe I'm wrong, but certainly I have a very visual imagination, and because I'm so immersed in Doctor Who, sometimes when I listen to Big Finish, I can almost sort of stage it with the sort of multi-camera setup and studio setting, just in my imagination, because I'm so used to it. Maybe that's just me. I'm only seeing it, so to speak. I'm only imagining it through that prism. So I'm not sure how someone who had no inkling of Doctor Who would what they would take away from it, whether they would appreciate it at the same level I do. I think there's some absolutely fantastic Big Finish stories that, in some respects, are head and shoulders above a lot of the television counterparts. A lot of the Sixth Doctor stories, for example, are far superior to his television outings. That work brilliantly as pieces of drama in their own right. I wouldn't necessarily, if no one had ever heard of Doctor Who, I wouldn't necessarily listen to this audio. I would probably carefully select certain stories for them to enjoy, and if they enjoyed that, then say, well, you might want to see or listen to these audios. Giggle Freaks asks, what are your favourite and least favourite stories? We've kind of done that one. What's your favourite regeneration, and what do you plan on doing after you finish the series? Favourite regeneration, it depends on how we're evaluating it, really. I mean, visually, you know, the special effects, that kind of aspect. I think really a regeneration is an emotional moment. It should be an emotional moment. It's the Doctor, or at least an incarnation of the Doctor, passing on, and, you know, he usually gets into that situation because he's had to sacrifice his life to save someone else, if he doesn't bump his head on a console. So I would say probably the Fifth Doctor regenerating into the Sixth Doctor in the Caves of Androzani is a good one. Not only visually, I think it's probably, of the classic era, the most visually accomplished effect, but also that emotional gravitas of him sacrificing his life quite without hesitation, pouring that antidote into Peri's mouth and saving her life, and then dying. And so it has an emotional punch, as well as the fear that this might actually be his death. There's a moment there where, you know, it could be give up, that it's a fight, it's a turbulent regeneration, and that's something that's reflected in a brilliant audio with Peter Davison. which I can't remember the name of. It's got to do with the seasons, and it has sort of 4 episodic stories: spring, summer, autumn, winter. And there's the winter one, I believe, is a really, really little clever. It turns out, well, I won't spoil it, but it's got to do with the Regeneration. It's great. Also, 9 into 10. When Eccleston regenerates into David Tennant, I think that's good. It's not overdone. It's not overwrought. It captures. It's done well. It's not as over-indulgent as Tennant's regeneration into Smith, but I'll get to that when we get to the video. Jormungandr. Jormungandr. After watching the recent Doctor Who Twitch marathon, I fell in love with classic Doctor Who. I warned you, Julius. He warned you. It was then that YouTube suggested me some of your amazing videos. Amazing production value, superb job. Thank you very much, Jormungandr. Now, in your opinion, aside from the serials, what supplemental content would you consider essential for the classic Doctor Who fan? Essential. Aside from what would I consider essential? So, seminal thing. I don't think I consider any of it essential for the classic Who fan. I think that there'd certainly be ones that are worth checking out, and I've mentioned a few already. I think there are ones which sometimes expand upon things that are established in the television programme or weren't done justice in the television programme. And on that note, I would probably say the Sixth Doctor, The Last Adventure with Colin Baker, which is 4 hour-long audios all linking and leading up to his regeneration, is probably worth a listen, because it has lots of characters that are established in Big Finish, but you don't have to know all their backstory to enjoy the individual stories, and they all link together. It's definitely worth watching Colin Baker's arc, his era, and the Trial of a Time Lord season, as well as Time and the Rani, the first of Sylvester McCoy's era, in order to know how it all fits in. But I think that's something worth checking out. That's probably the only thing I would say would probably be essential to have a listen to. There are lots of others that I've mentioned already that I think are really worth checking out, but they're not essential. Joseph Hudson said, if you could see a character from another TV show, movie or book become a companion, who would it be and why? Mine would be Wendy Darling from Peter Pan, because I feel she's what most companions are based on. Fantastic question. That's a really good point. Wendy Darling. I think certainly Amy is very, very Wendy Darling, that sort of fairy tale aspect. The girl who waited. What other character from another TV show, movie or book would I like to see enter the TARDIS? God, that's a really tough question. I'm not sure, to be honest. Whether it would make the best drama, or whether it would make it would just be fun, or whether it would be a sort of gifting that character a fantastic life. I really can't answer that, but I think that's a fantastic topic. Why don't I throw it out to you guys? Who do you think? I think that's a great question there. Another character from another TV show, a movie or a book who could become a companion, who would you pick and why? I'm sorry I can't satisfactorily answer that one, but it's a brilliant point. I think, actually, I'm going to steal your one. I think Wendy Darling is brilliant, and certainly that would be great for her as well. Peter Allen, I feel the Hartnell era doesn't get too much attention compared to the other Doctors, so my question is, which 3 missing episodes from this era would you like recovered? I think that's true. I think the Hartnell era doesn't always get as much attention, and I think that's partly because I think the foundation of what a lot of fans of Doctor Who have come to understand as the Doctor was really built upon with Patrick Troughton. So that's probably why. And also probably just the age of the programming. It was nice to see a lot of young people, incidentally, after this Twitch marathon, being enthused and interested and more knowledgeable in Doctor Who. I did find the London 1965 thing a little bit cringe, but, as I said, it's for new generations to enjoy in a different way. And it's such a bizarre thing that something I used to watch, and it was almost something you had to keep like a guilty secret. is now all over the internet, and there's young people that I teach who are enthused about this Ian and Barbara getting home in the chase. Anyway, I digress. 3 stories. Well, I mentioned Marco Polo. That's from the First Doctor's era. I think the other 2 I would choose would probably be the Daleks' Master Plan. That was hard to settle upon. It's a very bloated story. There's 2 episodes of the whole serial that exist. But I'd like to see all the others. I'm probably just being greedy, because if we save the Daleks' Master Plan, we get the most number of episodes compared to any other story. And I'd really just love to see that odd Christmas episode, which is in the middle of this big Dalek epic story with the Keystone Cops and the Doctor turning to the camera and wishing everyone a Merry Christmas. And I think also the Smugglers, a latter day historical with Ben and Polly, their first journey in the TARDIS. I like the audio, listening to the audio of that one, so it would be interesting to see. Brexit Dictator asks, what's your favourite multi-Doctor Who adventure or episode? Favourite multi-Doctor Who adventure? I think that a lot of multi-Doctor stories, they're better as an idea, they're better on paper than how they actually turn out. I always enjoy the 5 Doctors because, as I said in my Peter Davison video, it's one that I got when I was very young, and it was one of my first stories that really introduced me to Doctor Who. So it was a real nostalgic thrill. It's a bit paint by numbers, but I enjoy it. But that's a personal thing. If I were to say what do I think is the most proficient one, the one that works the best, and I know this is possibly going to be controversial, I would probably say The Day of the Doctor, the 50th anniversary special. I know it's only really got 2 Doctors in it, not including the War Doctor. John Hurt is brilliant in it, but it's always, there's that little pang of, I wish Christopher Eccleston had shown up. But I think that probably works best at capturing the essence somewhat of Doctor Who. That fantastic speech, which actually made my eyes water when I was watching it in a good way. With when they say he's never cruel or cowardly, echoing those legendary Terrance Dicks words. So that's probably what I would say. Jonathan Bermudez says, if Big Finish ever officially bring back the Unbound series, what questions would you like to see asked? That's a really fantastic question. Unbound, if you don't know, was a series of 6 stories, audio stories done by Big Finish back in the 40th anniversary, which had alternative doctors in them, and each story asked a question. So, what if the Doctor never left Gallifrey? What if the Doctor, when he was exiled to Earth, didn't arrive in the 70s but actually arrived in the late 90s? So all the invasions the Brigadier and unit had to put up with, they'd had to do it without the help, without the support of the Doctor. And they also did What If the Doctor Was a Woman, albeit it was a comedy story, not to be taken too seriously, with Arabella Weir as the Doctor, but it was an actual genuine story, and it doesn't ever really seem to get mentioned in all the fervour around the new Doctor. What questions would I like to ask? I that's a tough one, because they were very comprehensive. We had, like I said, the Doctor, what if he never left Gallifrey? We had if he didn't arrive until the 90s. I think there was one where it's what if the Doctor was sort of callous and thought the ends justified the means, and had sort of intentionally left someone to die. That was quite grim. We had what if the Valeyard won his trial against the Sixth Doctor and unravelled the universe. The Doctor is a woman, and there was a fantastic one as well, Robert Sherman one with Derek Jacobi, which was what if Doctor Who the television series had never been made, and it's about this fictionalised character who had come up with the idea, who was commissioned to write an initial script for Doctor Who, and it had never been made. And I think that one's really great. He's in a care home, and he starts imagining himself in the story of Doctor Who. So I think they really covered a lot of them. Really, I mean, I would say if Jodie Whittaker wasn't coming along as the 13th Doctor, I'd say, what if the Doctor was a woman, but you actually did it seriously, and you did it as a serious drama rather than as a comedy. Incidentally, David Tennant plays a Time Lord in that story back in his pre-Doctor Who days, as well as Colonel Brimacombe Wood, the rather sort of Malcolm Tucker-esque Scottish unit replacement of the Brigadier in Sympathy for the Devil, which is the one where the Doctor is exiled to Earth in the 90s, so it's worth checking out. Another tough question. I'm not sure about that. What scenario would I like to see? I think they were pretty... they covered a lot of them. I think an interesting one might be, just for the one story, might be, what if the Doctor was exiled to Earth, but he did not have any support mechanism? He didn't become a scientific advisor. What if it was further in the past? Perhaps what if the Doctor was exiled to Earth in the Victorian period, alternatively? Would have been a great opportunity for Jago and Lightfoot to appear, perhaps in a different guise. So moving on, we've got Thomas Grady, who asks, Hartnell or Troughton? Straight to the point. Another tough one. So you're getting me to try and pick favourites again, and I'm not great with that. If we were talking about which incarnation would I prefer out of those two, I'd have to go for Patrick Troughton, I think. I love the cosmic hobo, the eccentricity, the shabby, untidy, silly exterior, hiding the more mysterious, dark, manipulative side of him. I love that. But I would probably say that I enjoy the versatility and the changing nature of the First Doctor's era more. I think there's a wider variety of stories to be had in the First Doctor era, particularly in his first season. Whereas the Second Doctor kind of settled down into that sort of base under siege structure and maintained it for quite a long time. Okay, here's a tough question. Here's a big question. And Thomas Gentile has even said, big question. Every Doctor's greatest scene, in your opinion? I love to hear people answer this question. Every Doctor's greatest scene. This was a really tough one. I had to really think about this one. So I've noted them down. And without going into great detail and explaining every single one, I will mention them. And you can look them up if you don't know them. My favourite scene probably for the First Doctor is a speech that he makes at the end of the massacre of St Bartholomew's Eve when Stephen leaves. He mentions about how they've all gone, all his companions have gone, should he go home, but he can't. Second Doctor, that was an easy one, was our lives are different to everybody else's. That's the exciting thing. And I had that clip in my Second Doctor video. The Third Doctor is an interesting one. I would probably pick the scene where Jo Grant leaves at the end of the Green Death. There's not that much dialogue, but there's a great part where she's getting married, or she's just got engaged. He drinks his champagne and he leaves in Bessie, drives off into the sunset, and it's kind of bittersweet. It's very sad. The Fourth Doctor, Do I Have the Right? The Two Wires, when he's in Genesis of the Daleks. The Fifth Doctor's an interesting one. A lot of people would probably pick the whole eating a well-prepared meal speech that he makes to the Cybermen, but I find that's a little bit over the top. I actually really like... There's a little moment at the start of the Caves of Androzani where Perry asks the question that I think all the viewers had been wondering for a while, which is, why do you have a stick of celery on your lapel? And he tells her about how he's allergic to certain things and it changes colour if the gases that he's allergic to, and he eats it. I just like that little relationship between them there. The Sixth Doctor, I would say, in The Mysterious Planet, there's a moment where Perry realises that the planet they're on is actually Earth, and it has essentially everything she knew has gone, has died, and he makes this speech about how everything changes, nothing can be eternal, and it's a nice sweet little moment that really you see there, that moment, the way he delivers the lines, the way he reassures her while still being truthful, is something that Colin Baker has really picked up and gone with in his Big Finish career. Seventh Doctor, when he goes to the cafe in Remembrance of the Daleks and talks about ripples through time. For the Eighth Doctor, I'm just going to talk about the TV movie, and there's that moment where he sort of offers the jelly baby to the policeman, and then he pulls the gun, he lifts the gun off him, and instead of pointing at the policeman, he points at himself, and he says, do this or I'll shoot myself. And I just really love that moment. I think that's something where it could have been done so easily, where he threatened him with the gun. Ninth Doctor, very first episode, Rose, he makes that speech about the planet spinning. He says, that's who I am, I feel it spinning, we're going through space. And then he says, now forget me, and walks off. The 10th Doctor's interesting. There's a lot of grandstanding that goes on in David Tennant's time. But there's a nice moment in the Lazarus experiment towards the end where he talks to the Lazarus, and he says how he's lonely when you get old, when you live forever. You know, it seems like you want to strive for this, but actually, in the end, everyone goes. You've lost everything. I think it's quite a nice moment. With the 11th Doctor, that's a tricky one, because I really like a lot of the speeches and moments and scenes with Matt Smith Doctor. One of the ones I really like is the bit where he's trying to think in the Vampires of Venice, and he keeps putting hands on people's mouths and getting them to put hands on their mouth. I love that bit. But I would probably say one of the ones I really like is in the very last story of his first season, The Big Bang, where time is sort of unravelling, is winding back through his time stream, and there's that moment where he puts Amelia to bed, the young version of Amy, to bed, and he makes that speech to her about we're all stories, and it was a good one, and it's quite sweet. And then you realise that actually all along he's got this plan to plant this seed for her to remember him later. And I would say for Capaldi again, there's three moments that I think really stand out for Capaldi's Doctor. First one, I think everyone's probably going to guess this one, which is the speech he makes to the Zygons and to the humans about war and about the shooting, and everyone just needs to sit down and talk. It's obviously a fantastic moment. The other one is the speech he makes to the two masters in his penultimate story about, just be kind and help. But actually, I think the one that I like the most, and the one that really made an impression on me, was in Listen, when they, Clara and him, go back in time and end up bumping into the young Danny Pink, and there's something on his bed, and the Doctor's there, and he says, are you scared? Scared is good. Scared is a superpower. I really, really like that moment. I think it really captures a lot of what Doctor Who is about. So that's my answers to my Doctor Who and the Doctor Who opinions.